Hello gamers, Powered Heal here, and today we're going to be talking about horizontal progression, and we're just going to be roaming around the streets of Stormwind in the meantime. So, there was a video I released yesterday where we talk about the fake problems with World of Warcraft Classic, and one of the ones that I mentioned from the very start had a lot to do with horizontal progression. I believe they were kind of a different name for the problems that got used in the video, but still, it was basically referencing horizontal progression, and I talked about it quite a bit. There was a lot of pushback to that point in particular, so I wanted to make a separate video covering that because I think it's a topic that deserves a lot of honestly a lot of attention because I think there's some genuine confusion there. And to start, I think I do want to say that there are some areas of horizontal progression that I see could be naturally accessible to a game like World of Warcraft Classic Plus. And one of them was actually mentioned in the comment section of, I think, this video. Oh, yeah. I'll actually read the comment. This is going to be a video where we kind of go through comments and reply to them a little bit. So this one was, I used to be against transmog, but I completely 180'd when I realized there's a huge amount of free horizontal progression. Huge amount. One of the main reasons why people feel sunk costs about any given game is the cosmetics they've acquired and collections they've accumulated over the years. Many people feel more attached to their characters and thus will play more when they feel like they can visually express themselves and have a treasure trove of cool things they've gathered over the years. They're still relevant whenever they want to use them. I mean, look at retail. How many people maintain their sub and constantly log in year after year just to continually farm mounts, new cosmetics, and transmog? It's massive. It's literally free content. This allows Blizzards to monetize a cosmetic cash shop for more revenue, helps the longevity with development, and they can also do something like retail trading posts, which has been a huge success. It also gives people a ton of reasons to go back to continue doing content they otherwise would be done with. It's free content, gets people back out in the world doing things, and makes the world feel alive again. This is, I completely agree with this comment, and this is something that I sort of realized on my own a while back as well. Like because I'll be completely honest, like I just wanted transmog for transmog's sake because right now the character is looking pretty cool, right? But even now we have these ugly pants, right? And I actually have the tier 3 pants, but I have no reason to go back and get the tier 3 pants because I'm not going to spend like what was it, 12 or more plate scraps of the guild or buying them myself to get tier 3 pants to put around in Stormwind to run around with, when instead I could just put or instead I'm not going to be able to use these in raid, right? I have to use the empowered legs in raid because they're just that much better. If I could actually transmog them, right, then I'd be more inclined. And actually, in this specific example, this is a perfect example sort of getting people back out into the world because right now I'm pretty much done farming. I was actually farming gold for plate scraps because I was trying to help my guild. Like I bought the plate scraps for my boot entirely myself. I did half the plate scraps for my chest here. And that's because there's so many warriors in the raid, we were at like a deficit of plate scraps. But now I don't have any incentive to go out and farm more stuff in the world, which like I would to get plate scraps for my legs. Cause I'm not going to ask my guild for a cosmetic thing, right? Because I'm not just going to wear it around Stormwind. So yeah, I agree with this guy completely, and it hit me like back then, like wow, like not only do I just like transmog for transmog's sake, but this is sort of like a form of horizontal progression, and I think in some ways it's the most meaningful form you can have in a game like Classic Plus. I mean, you could maybe do other things, like you could put battle pets into the game if you wanted, have that be a separate thing, which people are gonna laugh when you say something like battle pets, but to like personally, I don't understand like why people would dislike something like battle pets, right? Because it doesn't have any impact on you as a normal player if you don't like to interact with battle pets, right? And it's purely for people who like to interact with the system. So yeah, you could do something like battle pets, which is like a similar thing where some battle pets drop off of some of the mobs in raid and stuff like that, or in dungeons. And yeah, I think transmog is like in many ways the ultimate horizontal progression because it's completely decoupled from power, right? And I think that's the thing that people don't quite get when we're talking about horizontal progression in WoW Classic, is that people don't really want it to be decoupled from, or they don't really want it to be coupled to power, right? Because they do want your character to get stronger from tier to tier to tier, and that is just the reality. Now, I've had some people mention some things, like some people mention Nax specifically. Trying to find this comment here. I don't know if yeah, I probably won't be able to find it, but like basically the gist of what he was saying is that Nax is like it. Not every tier has to be like Nax, where see like this shield is like way better than any other shield that came before it because it's a KT shield. If I were to have the KT mace, it would be like way better than this, right? This is another weapon in Nax, keep in mind, right? And the KT hammer from Nax is like 220 healing, which is absolutely insane. Even the next best healing weapon is like 200, or so it's 180 healing, and it comes from Cthulhu. So you have this, then you have that weapon, and then you have the KT weapon, which is just crazy better than anything else. I think that if you do the math on the KT weapons in particular, so I don't know if this counts the shield, but I think it's like a 30% damage increase from like the prior tier weapons or like the next best weapon, pretty much across the board, or maybe not across the board, but that's like the average or something like that. It's like 20 to 30%, and that's way, 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 way stronger than anything else that's kind of come before it, right? So I do agree with this guy that you don't have to have the Nax jump from one tier to another. However, I think the Nax jump is sort of it's unique because this was intended to be the ultimate raid of Classic, essentially, right? This is the way you were going to end Classic, so they wanted you to be super powerful. And ironically, I think the reason why they wanted Nax to be so powerful, outside of just, this is the capstone of original vanilla, original Classic era, is that they wanted the gear to persist into TBC because they obviously designed every item in TBC themselves, right? It's not like they had AI design it back then or anything like that. So clearly they understood the power levels, and they understood that some things from Nax would still be used in TBC. Now, they probably didn't expect things like, what's the item from AQ? The armor pen item to be quite as useful. Stuff like that was probably an oversight, right? But I think that they expected things like Rejuvenation Gem to still be pretty good, the Warmth of Forgiveness to be pretty good, like the actual Hammer of the Twisting Nether to still be pretty decent, right? They wanted these items to at least carry you through kind of pre-bis and into actual raid in TBC. So I think even there, they are attempting to mitigate as much harm caused by straight up vertical progression as possible, but there's still going to be vertical progression, right? That's the inevitability, and that's kind of what I'm talking about. So yeah, I agree with you that not every tier should be a 20 to 30% jump in power, right? That's kind of retail-esque. So if you thought that's what I was saying, that's not what I was saying. And I think that every tier really should be kind of like going from MC to Blackwing Layer, like around that type of power level, right? You should be creeping up in item power, but skipping a tier, you're not going to be like completely useless the next tier. You know what I mean? But like I said, for the majority of vanilla, this was true. It's just the exception is Naxxramas because it was intended to be the final, right? And they were intending to kind of go all out with, well, they weren't intending to go all out with vertical progression, but they were clearly intending to have that vertical progression. And I don't think anything we see in Classic Plus is going to be anywhere near going from, AQ to Nax, or then Nax to TBC. Like even later TBC, I mean. So I don't think you're going to have to worry, but the game you are going to get more powerful over time. So I want to read some of these other comments that talk a little bit about combat ideas or power ideas for horizontal progression and why I don't think they're so good. So there should be 3 levels or so of raids: gear on the level of MC, gear on the level of Blackwing Layer, and gear on the level of Nax. Different stat makeups, focuses on different stats, new aesthetics, but the raid should fit into 3 power levels or so. See, I don't think this is not going to work because like this is something you run into a different type of problem with this, right? Where this is kind of okay. I think what this guy has in his head when he's making this comment is the first time they release another set of instances that are parallels to MC, Blackwing Layer, and Nax, this kind of works fine, right? Because there's going to be enough that you can kind of tweak where you can make the item somewhat similar. Maybe some bis comes from Nax, some bis comes from the other equivalent Nax instance, right? It's going to be like the same thing. Some of the tier 2 bis comes from Blackwing Lair. Some of the tier 2 bis comes from another instance. You could put like another tier set, for example. You could make another raid like Blackwing Lair, and it has like a parallel tier set, you know, to something like Transcendence, where, and I think immediately what people are going to think about that is they're going to be like, oh, so you mean like, like a shadow version of Transcendence. I don't think that's a good idea. I think if anything, what you need to be able to do is, if we're going to actually have the meme specs be somewhat of a thing, which I think that they will in Classic Plus, you need to make it so that when you get like a piece of gear, either if you want it to be a token, or even if you just want it to be a piece of gear in general, you can change that piece of gear to match your spec, right? That has to be a thing. So in other words, like the new version of Blackwing Lair that they'd add, like the equivalent tier 2 instance, that wouldn't drop a shadow version of tier 2. It would just drop another type of set completely, right? Because the Transcendent set would have to be viable for healing as well as damage dealing, right? And then if you're a warrior, the Wrath, what is it, Wrath? Is that what it is? Or I forget what warrior tier 2 is called, but let's just call it Wrath. Or let's just call it Wrath. That would have to be viable for tanking, for DPS, for whatever. You know what I mean? And then the alternate instance, right? That, like, again, the same tier, so it's on par gear level with Blackwing Lair, but it has different items. That could have another tier set if you want, but they'd have to just go a different tier bonuses and just have like a different, thought in their mind for what they want to do with that set. The problem that you kind of run into, though, is that, one of these is going to be the best, period. And I think, ideally what you do is you would make enough good items in each one of these alternative instances where people have to run them all, is sort of the idea, right? But the trick there is that most of the time, or the problem there rather, is that most of the time they're not going to get the balance completely right. And it's kind of like rare that you're going to get people to, like, there's going to be one of these instances that you run less than the other ones. That's just going to be the reality. And it can kind of create this awkward situation where if like one class, but maybe it's not like a super impactful class, like let's say they allow Shadow Priest to be viable in Classic Plus, right? But you kind of bring like one per raid comp, and it's not like super good, okay? What's going to happen, and then let's say like their tier set that makes them like, gives them the most damage or whatever, is in this kind of like alternate version of Blackwing Lair where it's not actually Blackwing Lair, it's a different instance, but the item level is similar, right? But that's like one of the only good tier sets in that instance, and one of the only good kind of sets of items, period, or just items, period. A lot of people are not going to want to go back and do that raid because remember, it costs you time to do it, and it costs you resources to do it, right? And they're not going to want to go back and do that to just get their Shadow Priest, who isn't even doing that much damage, period, like a little bit more damage, right? So you can get into this like really tricky scenario when you try and have too many raids that are on the same kind of relative tier of power. And you have to keep in mind that it doesn't sound so bad time frame wise initially, right? Because you're like, well, if you play this game like even 20, 30 hours a week, you have a lot of time to do all this stuff. But the problem is the amount of time you're actually together with your guild, and you can get everybody together, even if you don't have 40, even if they drop it down to 20 or 25 man, you're still probably only raiding for your average guild 1 to 2 nights a week in this version of the game. This isn't a game like Retail where the standard has sort of become 3 nights a week if you're actually trying to progress seriously into Mythic, right? Because, it's just evolved as that's what you have to do to progress. But people in that game, I think they want it much more, right? They're playing for prestige, and they want to be able to say, hey, I cleared all the Mythic content in Retail. I don't think you're going to have the same drive from players to just farm tons of these raid instances in WoW Classic. So you can't just make like infinite horizontal expansions of Blackwing Lair, of Molten Core, because some of them are going to get left behind. That's just the reality. You're not going to have enough time to do all of them. In many ways, the vertical progression system ends up being better because wherever your guild is on the spectrum of vertical progression, you have raids behind you and you have raids in front of you, right? So, like right now at this guild, Full Send, we're actually running all the raids, okay? we have kind of like 2 official raid days and then one where most people show up anyway. So we run Molten Core, Blackwing Layer, AQ40, Nax 40. We clear them all, and we do what do you call it? The 20s as well. We work them in there, right? But let's say they continued this like classic hardcore server and they added like new raids or whatever, right? And we're trying to do these new raids, and they added like, let's say they added 2 raids after Nax, right? So now what would happen is the baseline would likely move. We just would not have enough time. We're already pretty much stretched at this point, right? Where sometimes it can be difficult to like, a lot of times we don't fill MC. Like we have spots open for MC, right? Because not everybody's coming to the Molten Core. So with that being the case, what would inevitably happen is we would do the 2 new raids, assuming we could clear them, right? We would do Nax, and maybe we would do AQ or Blackwing Layer, but MC would definitely get dropped, and maybe one of the other raids would get dropped as well, right? But that would be kind of fine because we're already past that progression curve, right? The vast majority of people in our guild already are geared to the level of, basically AQ40 and Nax, so we can shift our progression band to match that, and then anybody that we bring in that's new, instead of having to run them through the old raids, right? What we're realistically going to do is we're just going to bring them into AQ40 and Nax, and we're just going to essentially carry them and give them gear straight out of there to catch them up to us. So that's kind of like how the vertical progression cycle would work. And it is honestly healthier, I think, for the game. Like, in a way, like, you guys don't think it is, but it is healthier for the game and the guilds and the ecosystem overall to do that than to have, like, a million different raids from each tier, right? Molten Core tier, Blackwing Layer tier, Nax tier. That just won't work long term. And there's another comment here talking about what the raids should kind of give, right? And I want to see if this is the same comment. I think it's a different comment. Let me find this first here. Okay, this is another one. This is a separate comment, but I wanted to read this as well. I think you're mistaken when it comes to horizontal progression as being impossible for WoW, because classic WoW actually does have it. It was the expansions that broke the horizontal progression. Oh, this is the guy that was talking about the Nax loot and stuff like that. But I want to actually... this is a point of contention I want to have here, too. He's like, the top hand two-handers, Ashkandi, Dark Edge, Might, are all fairly close to each other. This is not true, right? Well, first of all, Might is from Nax, right? So that's the outlier. But Ashkandi and... the Dark Edge, this is one example, right, of things that are true. And, whenever you're trying to make a point, like, I don't really blame this guy, right? I'm not trying to flame him or say that he was doing this duplicitously, but, like, whenever you're trying to make a point, you'll look for, like, your one example, and usually people are sort of satisfied there, right? So I don't have Atlas loot because it's currently broken, but I believe he's sort of right on, like, the top end of Ashkandi versus Dark Edge. Like, I think Dark Edge is, like, 364 or something like that, and Ashkandi is, like, 344 top end. I don't know the low ends. I don't know the actual DPS. And I want to say, too, just to keep this in mind when we're making these comparisons, weapon DPS isn't completely irrelevant, right? Now, obviously, for a lot of classes that use, like, strikes and stuff like that, they want higher top-end weapons most of the time, right? And then stuff like Paladin, that like Tank Paladin obviously wants faster weapons, but that's pretty rare. Rogue wants generally faster offhands, but again, that's pretty rare, right? So generally speaking, you want, if you're going to be DPSing, and you're like a hunter or something, you're melee weaving, or you're like a rep paladin, or you're a warrior, you want high top-end weapons, okay? But the DPS is not completely irrelevant either, right? So even if the weapon, like, let's say there's like a 20 top-end differential, and you're like, okay, that doesn't seem that bad from this tier to this tier, but you don't look at the actual attack speed of the weapon, and maybe the axe is like 3.2 and the sword is like 3.7, but the 3.7 sword is still 20 top end below the 3.2 axe. And again, like, I'm not saying this is the case with Ashkandi versus Dark Edge, but I'm just giving you like a hypothetical example. That is kind of a dramatically worse weapon, right? Because it has less top end and it has less DPS overall. And the DPS is still going to factor in to some degree, right? Even though it's not going to be as prominent as the top end because you're using strikes all the time and stuff like that. So things that can appear to be like similar between tiers sometimes aren't all that similar. That's kind of like the main thing I wanted to say there. And think about healing weapons, right? So he mentions Ash Candy and Dark Edge being pretty close, but think about something like what's the weapon off Neff? It's the one, I forget what it's called. You guys know what I mean though. The healing mace, right? Now, technically, this is not a pure healing mace, and you could probably argue this is why the healing value is so low on it, right? Because technically it is damage healing. But there's no pure healing equivalent in Blackwing Lair. So Blackwing Lair just doesn't even have a pure healing weapon, right? And this is pretty much the de facto healing weapon. However, even if you did want to add a healing weapon to Blackwing Lair, what do you think the healing value would be? I think it would probably be like a 120 healing if Neff dropped like a pure healing weapon, right? And then compare that to AQ 40, right? AQ 40 drops a 180 something healing one-hand mace, right? So quite a substantial difference there, right? Definitely a bigger difference than for the weapons on its surface, and there's some gear that's really good at AQ40, like the Scarab Brooch is like really good, right? And yeah, you have things like Rejuvenation Gem in Blackwing Lair that are quite good, that kind of stand the test of time, but that's really sort of, a lot of classes only get like one good trinket if they get a good trinket from Blackwing Lair. And I think what this guy is trying to say too is that, if you just make the system and keep it like you have in Classic, where you have items in Blackwing Lair like Rejuvenation Gem that are still really good. This is sort of like a form of horizontal progression. I wouldn't call that a form of horizontal progression so much as I would call it, what's the thing that we talked about in the last video? It's like, it's solving the problem of progressing the characters too fast, right? But that's not explicitly being done to like progress horizontally. If you want to call it horizontal progression, that's absolutely fine. Doesn't really matter that much. But my point is that I agree with you there. Like, I agree that you should have items like Rejuvenation Gem, right? That are like standouts for their particular bracket, and they carry you maybe even a tier or two beyond, right? And this does sort of help stymie the negative effects of vertical progression. But on the whole, those things are going to be exceptions to the norm, right? The problem is the gear still gets better from MC to Blackwing Lair, right? The gear still gets better from Blackwing Lair to AQ. The gear still gets better from AQ to Nax, even if they were to nerf Nax gear a little bit. And again, I think KT is the real standout here. But even if they were to nerf some of the KT gear, it would still be quite better, right? So I agree with you. I agree that we should have these cool kind of like chase items that are like really rare from bosses that are maybe like overstated for their given tier. That's kind of like a really cool thing. It incentivizes people to go back, right? Keeps people running the raid. So none of that, I'm not disagreeing at all with you there. But I'm just saying the trend is still always going to trend upwards in this style of game. And there's really nothing you're going to be able to do about it, right? So I'm going to read the rest of this comment. Hold on. Various trinkets across the raids were abyss depending on what you wanted. Some item set bonuses worth keeping longer than just the raid it dropped in. Plus the gear you got helped your next set of gear. What classic people really don't want is their gear just becoming trash. Something like 5-man badge gear replacing raiding gear would be a problem. See, like, I agree that 5-man badge gear replacing raiding gear would be a problem in the very short term, right? However, in the long term, 5-man badge gear or whatever absolutely should be replacing something like Molten Core Blackwing Lair gear. Like, think about it like this. If we have, let's say, 8 or 9 tiers of content out, right? So keep in mind, Nax is like tier 4. Technically tier 3, but if you want to count AQ as a tier, you could count it as like tier 4, right? So then this would say tier 5, tier 6. Well, actually, we'll say that like tier 7 is out or something like that, right? So this is 3 raids beyond Nax. Do you really think that when people come into the game, they should have to progress like all the way from baseline or something like that, right? It's just not going to happen, right? And then again, if you make tier 7 equivalent in gear to tier Nax, what is the incentive to run tier 7, right? Or one of these raids is getting dropped, essentially. Either the tier 7 raid is getting dropped, or Nax is getting dropped, right? Or tier 6 is getting dropped, or tier 5 is getting dropped, the ones that came out in between, right? Something is getting dropped here. You're not running all these raids on schedule, and it's just going to cause a lot of problems, because inevitably somebody's bis is going to be in different raids, and people are not going to want to go to that raid, right? There was another comment about weapon skill and stuff. Oh, here it is. So there is so much space in Classic to do at least some sort of innovative stuff without completely outclassing old items. Like there are many specs that have bonuses. Make Feral Druid set. This I don't think that I think that English may not be the first language here, so I'm trying to just like parse the gist of this. But he's basically saying Affinity Warlock sets, Arm Warrior rating sets, and many others. Also, you could do stuff with weapon skills like Mace, Sword, that gives non-humans +7 weapon skill for swords, or +7 skill for non-orcs, or +7 dagger skill for only gnomes and undead, plus arcane damage, plus holy damage, caster gear, plus magic resistance piercing. Maybe the tank set, maybe the tanks get a set that is as good as Nax's set, but also has shadow resistance and some sort of PvP bonus. See, that would just make it okay. So if the a lot of things to unpack here, right? If the set was literally as good for tanking everything else as Nax, but then had shadow resist on it, then it is strictly vertical progression, right? Because this is now strictly better. Like you would use this in every scenario. You know, there's no, I don't know, there's just no reason you wouldn't, right? And then he's talking about sets with PvP bonuses, right? I like the idea of adding, like I said, PvP gear into PvE as sort of like, and they kind of function as like PvE side grades, right? But for PvP players who really like the PvP, those are outlets of gear where now those players don't have to compete with the players that are really vying for the PvE gear, right? So I like the idea of having some PvP stuff in the raid, right? Not necessarily, it doesn't have to be explicitly for PvP, but just stuff that you would look at and you'd be like, oh, that's itemized in a way where it makes a lot of sense for PvP, right? However, the problem is that like you're not gonna do a raid where like that is the point of getting gear. So for example, let's say they added a raid beyond Nax, or a raid that is sort of like the equivalent of Nax power wise, but it's like got PvP gear in it, right? It's got a lot of this like random off-spec gear, this kind of like this niche stuff, right? Nobody is gonna want to run that raid really to get other people niche gear, right? Like I don't want to spend like 3 or 4 hours of my time and like probably hundreds of gold on consumes to run a raid where I have no chance of getting like really good stuff for what I want in terms of like, let's say I'm playing Healing Paladin and I want to purely play PvE Healing Paladin, right? So why would I go into this new raid where there's basically not going to be any PvE healing upgrades to farm like niche gear for like some random Shakadin set or a random PvP rogue set or something like that, right? It makes kind of zero sense. And then there's another side of this where people are like, well, you don't have to put it in the raid, right? You just have to put it in other places, right? And then my argument to that is, well, yeah, but if the gear is then too good, like let's say you could get really good niche PvP gear by doing some type of solo activity, right? Then what is the point of having any of the PvP system gear or, you know, using any gear from raid to PvP or anything like that, right? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think that's a big problem that people aren't really looking at here. And then like the other thing he mentions, like weapon skill and stuff like that, those things are going to be BIS for some classes, right? So inevitably you're either adding a really good BIS item to a raid that has a bunch of other bad items. So now you're kind of like almost forcing players to go into a raid where the majority of the loot is going to be garbage to get like some really good items, right? Which people are not going to want to do. They're going to think that's like super lame. Or it's just going to be strictly better. Like there's going to be a lot of gear in there that's strictly better for everybody, and then you are back on the vertical progression timeline. He mentions, what if there's additional attack power against demons, like for a demon raid? Again, like this, people don't like to get gear sets specifically to do content. This is actually a huge problem in New World, actually, because that's how the dungeons actually worked in that game. Is you would go and you'd get protections against a certain type of mob. The mobs had different like damage types, like earth and other stuff like that. And and like lost was like the ghost type, for example, and you get gear that had like lost resistance and stuff like that, and you would use that to do the mutations, which were the dungeons. They were kind of like the mythic dungeon of New World, but people actually kind of hated it because it's like, you had to get new sets of gear for every dungeon, right? And then they added affinities on top of that, which is the dungeons got additional elemental effects, and then you would have to swap in new gems to compensate for that affinity. So if it was like frost affinity on lost, you would need lost protection gear and frost protection gear. And now you're just creating this whole thing where you're on a gear treadmill of getting gear that you don't even want. I think that's the biggest problem. I've seen another comment on one of the previous videos where people were talking about how, oh, I want them to really lean into resistance gear more. You really don't. Trust me. Resistance gear is generally really bad. I think actually Classic, I might make a separate video about this, but Classic era uses resistance gear to almost the best possible way you possibly could, and that's because it's generally not necessary raid-wide. You don't need your raid to have fire as your entire raid for Molten Core. You need it on specific people, try and do a specific job, right? Or on specific, maybe classes for safety in some area. You don't need your entire raid to have frost resistance gear for Saf. You don't need your entire raid to have shadow resistance gear for Twin Imps, right? You don't need your entire raid to have nature resist gear for Huhuran. What makes the execution, whether it was intentional or not, of resistance gear in Classic so great is the fact that it is a nuanced conversation where it's not just like everybody needs a certain minimum level of gear. I actually heard an idea from like Cargos or Hammer Dance or something that I thought was so bad, and it was like, what if they did the heat thing like in Season of Discovery, but you need like a certain level of fire resist on everybody to stop taking perma-ticking damage when you enter Molten Core. And it's like, that is the lamest thing possible, right? If anything, you should be able to, if you're skilled enough, you should be able to get by on doing content with the lowest possible amount of gear. That's a super cool thing about this game. That was the cool thing about Apes stepping into Molten Core, being like level in the 50s, right? And they're just executing so well, and they're optimized their damage and their raid comp and everything like that, and they're able to take out these bosses despite being super, super undergeared, right? That would all be killed if you added something like a heat level to Molten Core, where all of a sudden now they have to farm like 50 or 100 or 125 FR on everybody in order to even progress into the instance. That would be like mind-bogglingly stupid, right? And what is the point of farming this gear? You're going to farm it for Molten Core, and then it's going to sit in your bag. You're not going to use it. Maybe use it partially for Blackwing Lair. Then when AQ comes around, you're not going to use it again. Like, so you're literally just doing chores. You're giving yourself chores to do. And again, I made this argument before, right? People could say that the entirety of an MMO is chores. I disagree, because if you're doing something and gaining something that you want to use for like broad application, it doesn't feel like a chore, right? This character, right? If this guild stops playing, right, and I want to rip this character to a normal realm, or let's say I was playing on a normal realm and not a hardcore realm, right? And I don't even have to rip the character. I can take this character into battlegrounds. I can heal dungeons with this character. I can heal raids with this character. Like, I can do anything I want with this character. It's not locked to dealing with a specific type of content with this gear. This gear is good across the board. That's what makes it cool, right? Imagine if this gear was all like shadow protect, and like to even walk into Naxxramas, right? You needed an X amount of shadow resistance, and all the Nax tier gave shadow resistance because there was a looming shadow presence on you the entire time, where you would take more damage if you didn't have a certain amount of shadow resist, right? And then I try and use this gear in PvP, and all of a sudden I just have only shadow res. I don't have any healing stats. I don't have any armor or anything like that. It'd be terrible, right? It would just be absolutely terrible. So these forms of horizontal progression, they just don't really work in a game like World of Warcraft Classic. And I'm going to read this last comment. We'll end the video with this, because I think that this guy he's just not getting it either. The big problem has always been that raiding is the endgame. WoW doesn't have parallel systems that are just as valuable. All other content loops inevitably lead to raids. Want to master profession? The best recipes are in raids. Want to be questing adventurer? The quest line ends in raids. Want to collect non-combat pets? The rarest one drops in raids. You want to focus on small group content? Fine, but you can only find groups for dungeons that gear people for raids. Focus on PvP, you'll get stomped by people geared in raids. So the problem, first of all, there's a lot to unpack here, right? First of all, the PvP thing is not really true. And I think that whatever they do for the PvP system in Classic Plus, it'll be similar to Classic Era, where you can easily get by using PvP weapons. Like, you don't need a King's Fall, basically. Like on Rogue, just to use it as an example, the dagger that you get from being rank 14, right, which is basically accessible to everyone now. Sorry, somebody just messaged me here. But yeah, the dagger that you use you get from rank 14, that is basically equivalent to the Cthulhu dagger, right? And you don't need the King's Fall dagger from Nax to compete in PvP, or Nax tier 3 or something like that. Like, you can use the PvP set just fine. That's not a problem. And actually, I think that the game is better like that, because I'm going to make a specific video on this. But if you are going to have a system where you can kind of guarantee get the items like the PvP system, then I think the raid gear should be slightly better for PvP gear at the top level. Slightly better. Again, not super better, but at least slightly better, right? So this point about PvP is wrong. The problem with these other things that he's mentioning, like if you want to be a questing adventure, the quest line ends in raids. Yeah, but you can't have the questing. If you want to have quest lines that go on for infinity, you can do that, right? But they can't be rewarding you gear that's on par with the raids, because nobody would do the raids. Because the style of this game, this is what you guys don't, or some people don't get, right, about this game. The point of this game is still the end game. It is a vertically progressed game where the whole idea is you get to level 60 and then a bunch of the game unlocks at level 60. And that has always been the point of the game. The fact that the leveling was longer doesn't mean than other games, doesn't mean that it's not an end game focused game. Okay? If anything, they thought when they were making this game that the leveling was super short, because the leveling in EverQuest was even longer than this. So they actually nerfed the leveling with the entire point of highlighting and getting everybody to the end game. They wanted people to experience these end game raids where everybody's getting together, everybody's doing stuff as a group in the end game. That was the whole point of this game. It was not just about purely leveling. I'll make a separate video about that, but you guys are just wrong there. And that's why all the gear, like the best gear, comes from raiding, right? Because if you had other content loops, like if you wanted to be a master profession crafter, you could craft all your BIS items from professions, or most of them, there would be no point in going into the raid, right? You have to pick a style of game. In games where you have a sandbox, right, like early New World, the best items came from crafting, because that's the how the game was designed, right? You could get fill or static items from the raid, but the game was designed to be an open sandbox where you went into the world, you farmed resources, right? You use those resources, you turn them into these really strong items, and you had a chance to get BIS, right? That was the whole point of the game. And in any sandbox style open world trading crafting game, the focus is going to be on the professions. That makes sense. That's where you're going to get the best gear. This is not that open of a sandbox. Like, there's a sandboxy element to this game, but it is a theme park at its core, and it is about the end game at its core, and that's why the end game raids reward the best stuff, and that's why the game is a vertical progression game, because the idea is every raid tier is going to be a slight bump in power over the last, right? The best recipes are in raids. Yes, again, of course they will be, right? And then he talks about small group content. If you could do small group content and get the best gear, nobody would do the raids, because it's way easier to organize logistically 5-man content. This is why even in retail, right, you don't get the best gear from Mythic Plus. There's a cap on it. You know what I mean? So it's, I don't know. That's kind of like the final point for the video, is that there's just a misconception with what this game was meant to be. And I think it's because for a lot of people, this was people's first MMO, and they truly felt like, because the leveling took forever, that the point was all about the journey and the leveling and stuff like that. But like in reality, this was a truncated version of EverQuest, right? They nerfed the hell out of EverQuest progression because they wanted everybody. They streamlined this game in particular because they wanted everybody to reach the end game and be able to participate in it. And by and large, it worked. Like, Nax didn't have really great participation, but everything else did. And the intention was to make a vertically progressed game that, you advance from tier to tier to tier to tier. And the intent was also to make sure everybody got into the end game where they could start that progression. So by the end of the game ending in, like, was it 2006 or something, to go to TBC, not everybody had made it all the way through all progression tiers, but a lot of people had at least made it into the end game and had done some form of progression, which was a relative win for them when you compare it to how many people actually got to the end game and progressed really far in a game like EverQuest, right? And that's what made this game so successful, right? The game that came before EverQuest wasn't nearly as successful, doing that old school style strategy of, the whole game is the whole game, right? Like, the leveling itself is the progression, right? What got so many people that weren't just into RPGs and MMOs and all this stuff into this game is that they actually got into this sort of like pseudo competitive PvP/PvE environment way quicker than they would in other games. And you had people that played FPS start to play this game. You had people that play RTS start to play this game. I was like an RTS FPS player before I became an MMO player. Like, this game brought in players from all sorts of different genres because it was so streamlined and, like, way more casual and focused on the end game than EverQuest. So for you guys to say that it shouldn't be focused on that, you're just looking for a different type of game, man. That is the reality. But anyways, that's my TED Talk. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.